afternoon is coming to you from Normandy, in northern France, from the beaches of Normandy, particularly Omaha Beach. Now, Omaha Beach, this is the first of a couple of videos I'm going to do on the D-Day operations, the D-Day landings, which occurred, of course, June 6, 1944. And Omaha Beach, which we are at here, was, of course, the location of the most fierce fighting of the D-Day operation. This was an American beach along with Utah Beach, and it was here in Omaha that there were some 3,000, I believe it's 3,881 that perished in the wave assaults on this beach. And of course that doesn't account the many that would have perished in the subsequent operations after gaining a beachhead here. Attacking things like the hedgerows, for example, which were natural terrain obstacles a little more inland. But Omaha Beach was so devastating to the Americans. The first wave during the Omaha Beach operations, which began June 6, 1944, actually almost failed. They were almost completely wiped out, to such a point that commanders in charge of the operation, American commanders, almost called the operation off, and briefly the Germans, who were holding the high ground here at Omaha Beach, had actually for a moment thought that they had achieved success at the Omaha Beach location here in Normandy. A common, maybe historical myth, particularly for Americans about D-Day, was that given the tremendous overwhelming firepower that was kind of unleashed in the Normandy operations, that success was somehow guaranteed. This is the largest amphibious operation in human history. It's an operation which 500,000 people took part in. It's tremendous. When the navies were traversing this channel with battleships, which would shell the shores with tremendous firepower, transport ships, virtually every ship you could imagine was coming ashore here. All numbers of equipment that came aboard here. And one of the great myths is that with such overwhelming technological strength, that the D-Day operations were destined to be a success. That's really not true. The D-Day operations, once they began, especially on the first day, particularly at places like Omaha, for a period of time held on a knife edge. Success was not guaranteed. And indeed, when we look at the operation here at Omaha Beach, there were some real shortcomings, some of which, for example, were some failures of intelligence and planning, which led to some failures with respect to miscalculations with the depth of the water, which caused some of the floating Sherman tanks. They used to drop these Sherman tanks with flotation devices around them with their crew attached to them. Some of those tanks were swamped and they sank in the water, taking their crew with them. Much of the German defenses were also largely untouched when the first waves had landed on the beach, despite heavy bombardment. And so this operation really proves that D-Day was not a guaranteed success before it happened. There was a lot of things that had to work out, and I think commanders at the time, like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was, of course, Supreme Allied Commander, they knew that all too well. And, of course, the June 6th operation was a delayed operation. It was supposed to have happened the day before. The weather was very bad at that time. The seas were high. There was lots of rain and fog. It was very difficult conditions to operate in. And so there were a lot of things that hung in the balance. And, of course, there were many efforts used to deceive the Germans, and I'll talk more about those in our next video, which will come over at Gold Beach. One of the reasons, however, that Omaha Beach was so bad was because of the geographic landscape. The geography of Omaha Beach has these bluffs and even cliffs. And down here, you see these cliffs. These cliffs had mobile 155mm German howitzers on them, which were plaguing the soldiers as they tried to take a beachhead here. And it was actually left to U.S. Rangers, who had to scale the rock cliffs and try to take out these 155mm howitzers. It was a daunting task, and they did this while facing enemy fire. when troops originally got on the beaches here, and I'll just say, this is not Florida soft sand, folks. This is heavy, thick stuff. And when it gets wet, it's even worse. And you can imagine, as the soldiers came ashore, they would have been dropped off in what we call Higgins crabs. These kind of they're almost like floating lunch boxes. And you might encounter some of the underground concrete structures that the Nazis had put out there, which caused the craft to basically become stuck further out. You had to jump out of these crafts, and you would be soaking wet. You'd be undertaking all this fire. Then you get on the beaches, and you're in this wet sand. Very difficult. And so for a soldier, the first thing you wanted to do was get off of the beach and get to the road. But ironically, the road was just back there. But ironically, in the first day of the assault, June 6, 1944, getting off the beach and being on the road was not initially the best thing to do, because it made you very vulnerable to German sniper fire. And so initially, during the first wave, many soldiers were tied down, literally pinned down here. No holes, nothing to dig yourself into. Many of them had to play dead early on during the first wave to prevent from being killed, because the first wave was almost nearly wiped out. Of course, it's also the last thing I'll say before we go to our next video over at Gold Beach. It is, of course, associated with the U.S. contribution at the Normandy operations that we remember the so-called Bedford Boys. Bedford, Virginia, which today is the home to the National D-Day Memorial in the United States, is there because Bedford, Virginia suffered the highest casualty rate of all units during the Normandy operations. I believe it was some 93%. 21 people from Bedford, which is a small place, 21 people lost their lives, causing Bedford to become infamous for the percentage, the scale of death exacted on that small community as a result of the operations beginning with Normandy in Europe to defeat the Nazis. Hi everyone, this is Professor Philip Travis, and here we are in Islay, I believe that's the right pronunciation. We are in northern France at Normandy, and this is the second video on a brief video tour of the sites of the D-Day landings, which began, of course, in the morning of June 6, 1944. And here we are in this small little town on the English Channel, and just to the west of us, about 3 miles or so, is where you will find the location of Gold Beach, which of course is where many of the British soldiers did their primary landing. But this site here is particularly interesting, and the reason it's interesting is because of what you see behind me. If you look behind me and you see these metal structures that look like floating barges that are kind of out here in the water, these are actually portions of the old mulberries. And the mulberries were, of course, the idea of the British and Winston Churchill, and they were critical to the efforts at Normandy. The mulberries were used after the initial beachheads were obtained. You had to have a way to get your supplies up there. I mean, we're talking about tanks and trucks and food and supplies, guns, large artillery pieces, all had to be brought ashore. And so you had to have ports to move these types of things ashore. And it was the idea of the British, Winston Churchill, to create these temporary floating ports. And they became known as mulberries. And these pieces of metal that you see floating out in the water, or kind of, stuck in the water in the sand, are actually the remnants of the old mulberries. These were put in place on June 8, 1944, if I'm not mistaken, and they played a fundamental role in the D-Day landings, in the operations to supply the troops once they had gained footholds on the D-Day beaches like Gold Beach, which is just out to the west of us, along the Normandy coast in the English Channel, about 3 or 4 miles, where the British would have landed. And of course, these were integral to the overall operation and the success of the Normandy operation. It would be impossible to restore these types of things, but I think it's kind of neat to see them as sort of relics of this past, and come here and sort of imagine what they would have been like when they were connected together, forming this important temporary port that moved so many items in need of the war effort, in support of the war effort, to shore here in Normandy in northern France, following the June 6th, 1944 operation, which began, of course.